back to Rochester, I knew a family that had two teenagers, and they had two of them right around. One went on to become a lawyer, and the other was an engineer.
I'm sure.
Well, with macro degeneration, as you said, you should have been permanent vision. So you can use major.
But then eventually.
Oh, no, not that's retinitis pigmentosa, where it goes away to nothing. But macular degeneration is your macula, which is all the fine vision, is what all the blood vessels go out of control. But you still, I mean, you can recognize shapes and things like that, and you can blow letters up front and make one read up. But they went through college with one of these video readers like I have. When we went to
All right, well then, take it away. They don't want to hear me, they want to hear you.
Good evening, everybody. Let's see, is that better? Can you hear me? Okay, good. I can't hear me, so I'm relying on you to tell me if you can. No, you can't? Yes, you can. This side can. Yes? Okay, we're good now. Excellent. Thank you all so much for being here. I appreciate that. I'm Jonathan Haupt. I'm the executive director of the Pat Conroy Literary Center, which is a nonprofit in Beaufort, South Carolina, about an hour and a half from where we are. We were established by a group of Pat Conroy's friends and family after Mr. Conroy passed away to be a sort of living legacy to Pat. And we do sort of two things simultaneously all the time. We are an interpretive center. We're open to the public, as you can see. So there is a museum, if you will, to Mr. Conroy, and people come from all over the world to see that museum, about 3,000 people a year. Many of them telling us that they've come to Beaufort specifically for Pat Conroy. And we've come to think of them not just as tourists, but as sort of literary pilgrimage. It's a really special experience for them to visit the center, and I'll show you some pictures of the center for those of you who haven't seen it yet, which I think is just about everybody. But the other half of what we do is what I get to do with you all tonight, which is go out and talk to people and tell Pat Conroy stories. That's basically my job, which sounds like a great job if you're here because you're a Pat Conroy fan. I'll tell you there's one difficulty to it that will always be the case, and that is there used to be this other guy who went around telling Pat Conroy stories for his living. His name was Pat Conroy. How many of you ever met him at Savannah Book Festival or some other event? Quite a few of you from what I've already heard tonight. Yeah, I did too, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. What I've been doing a lot lately has been a really enjoyable experience for me, and that's getting to go out into communities, private communities very often, and tell some Pat Conroy stories. So today I get to do that here at the Landings at this very lovely facility. Yesterday I did it at a slightly different kind of gated community. I was at the Allendale Correctional Institute. Yes. Where I teach a creative writing class for a group of prisoners who originally signed up to be in a journalism class, but it turns out what they really want to do is write memoirs and short stories and novels and poetry and try and change the ending of their own stories. They want to use storytelling and writing as a sort of healing exercise, as an empathy exercise. So it's been a really wonderful experience to get to do that as well. So those are sort of the two bookmarks of what I get to do lately. Prison work, talking to y'all. A lot less orange jumpsuits in the room tonight, too, I notice. So this is our guy, by the way, for anybody who's not that familiar with Pat Conroy. He got to tell stories based on his life for about 50 years. That was the time that Pat was a professional writer. And 12 books have been published so far under his byline, 11 while he was alive, to see them. And then a 12th down here in the corner, A Low Country Heart, was published after he passed away. Now let's gauge the audience a little bit. How many of you have read at least one of these books? Is that almost everybody? That's great. That's a good sign. Let's skip ahead. How about that? Anybody at the halfway point? Anybody recognize at least 6 of these? Good. That's a few of you. Excellent. Anybody else at all 12? Any other? Oh, 2, 3 of you? That's wonderful. I'm glad to hear that. Well, even if you're not familiar with all 12 books, you're probably familiar with all 4 of these films. 4 of Pat's books were made into major motion pictures. Conrack, based on The Water is Wide, right there at that end, 1974, filmed not far from where we are on a sea island in Georgia. And Great Santini, 1979, filmed mostly in Beaufort, South Carolina. Then Lords of Discipline, 1983, and then, of course, Prince of Tides, 1991, also filmed primarily in Beaufort, South Carolina. What all 4 of these books and films have in common, and what indeed virtually all of Pat's books have in common, is that ultimately they're stories of teachers and students. Either that's the central focus of the work, or it's at least a major subplot of the work. About a teacher on a sea island, first white teacher, first male teacher on an isolated South Carolina sea island. If you've read The Great Santini, you know that Ben Meacham's high school experience is central to that novel. It's a little less important in the film, but in the novel, Ben's teachers present him a different model of adulthood and masculinity than his abusive father does. And in The Lords of Discipline, of course, we have the story of a military college cadet and his experiences with his teachers and his classmates and the era in which that story happens. And The Prince of Tides, about a disgraced teacher and coach trying to put his life back together. Teacher and student, time and again. And it's really in that capacity that I met Pat, because he was my teacher, not in the classroom sense of that word, but in the larger sense of that word. During the last 5 years of his life, Pat Conroy and I were partners in a publishing endeavor called Story River Books. I was director of the University of South Carolina Press in Columbia, and Pat and I were publishing novels and short story collections by other writers that he thought were worthy of publication and may not have had a shot without somebody like Pat Conroy on their side. So he got to be my mentor about how to do all of this, and I got to be his mentor about how small press publishing worked, because Pat was publishing with some of the largest publishers in the literary world at that time. So we too were teacher and student, often trading roles back and forth, which is the best kind of student-teacher relationship. So I got to know him when he looked like that guy, but I want to tell you a little bit more about much younger Pat Conroy, and this will help explain why we even have a Pat Conroy Literary Center. Pat was the oldest of 7 siblings. That's him in the back, about the time that he's about to go up to Defusky Island and teach there. This is his father, Colonel Don Conroy, right there, one of the most highly decorated Marine aviators of his generation. Colonel Conroy had clearance to deliver atomic weapons. That's how good of a fighter pilot he was. But this is a guy who couldn't leave the battle on the battlefield. He was physically and verbally abusive and intimidating to his whole family, and Pat, as the oldest kid, got the worst of that. Counterbalance to that is Pat's mother on this side, Peggy Conroy, who was born in the backwoods beyond the backwoods and grew up in rural Alabama and Georgia without much access to public education. But she found her way to libraries and therefore to books, and she in many ways sort of self-educated herself. She was incredibly well-read and had a very rich intellectual life, and Pat picked up on that as well. So on the one side we have this figure of violence and intimidation, on the other, a figure of imagination and empathy and creativity. And Pat resulted from both of those. That's Pat, as I mentioned. This is his the older of the 2 sisters right here is Carol. That's the second sister, Kathy. This is brother Jim, brother Mike, brother Tim, brother Tom. Pat's not the only one of these kids who grows up to be a writer. 3 of them do, in fact. And again, that reflects very well on their mom and how much time she spent introducing the power of words and language and books and literature to them. Pat's sister Carol Ann becomes a published poet as well, and brother Tim right here, after he retired from a long and wonderful career in special education, went on to become a published poet also. I want to share with you just a real short sentence about Pat talking about this family of his, and it's from a book called The Death of Santini. Most of Pat's sentences are really, really long, as you may know if you're a lover of Mr. Conroy's writing. This one is short and to the point. For a long time, I thought I was born into a mythology instead of a family. Pat grew up thinking everything was larger than life because of the powerful presence of his parents, who really seemed like mythical figures to him. So I'm going to introduce you to some other people now, Pat's teachers, in just a second. And they're going to sound like amazing people the way that Pat describes them. But remember, everybody sounds kind of amazing to Pat Conroy. So we're going to go from 24-year-old Pat Conroy to this kid right here, 16, 17-year-old Pat Conroy. Conroy's moved to Beaufort, South Carolina in 1961. It's the first time anybody in the family has been in the Low Country. And they are coming here because Colonel Conroy is assigned to the air station in Beaufort. This is just before the Cuban Missile Crisis. That's why it was so important to have a guy like Colonel Conroy at the air station. It's the 23rd time the family has moved since Pat has been born. Beaufort High School is the 10th school he will go to. It's about to enter the 11th grade. So it's been a new school every single year. That's been his military brat upbringing. Beaufort High is different than any other school Pat has gone to in two really important ways. And they're ways that make Pat Conroy possible. They help create the man that we will see as Pat Conroy later in life. First, Beaufort High is the first public high school Pat has ever gone to. Till this point, everything has been a Catholic school. He's been raised Roman Catholic, just like his dad. And second, as I mentioned, he's been moved from school to school every single year. But when they arrive in Beaufort, they know they're going to be there for 2 years. That the colonel's appointment at the air station is for 2 years. Pat arrives for his junior year, knowing he's also going to have his senior year and will graduate from Beaufort High. Those two things finally give him enough time in one place with one group of students and one group of teachers to start to figure out who he is. Until this point, he's been the shy, awkward, forgettable kid, never had a friend, never really noticed by a teacher, with maybe one exception. Hasn't been a particularly good athlete until this point. At Beaufort High, 2 years, one school, an amazing group of students and teachers, things start to happen. Pat becomes captain and MVP of the basketball team by his senior year. He's a point guard, same position he'll play at the Citadel. College just a few years later. Shy, awkward kid is now senior class president, best all around, Mr. Congeniality. He's the May King, which is the equivalent of the prom king. He's in the National Honor Society. He's playing other sports as well. Because Beaufort High then, as it is now, is incredibly welcoming to military families. Beaufort is a military town to this day. So Pat has no trouble whatsoever making friends. Not only making friends, but making friends who are on the same kind of path that he is. And what allows for that is that Beaufort has a literary magazine at that time called The Breakers. And at 16 years old, Pat Conroy is published for the very first time. Breakers Literary Magazine, Beaufort High School. He was writing poetry at that point. He wants very much to be a poet, like a lot of his literary heroes. And the poems that he is publishing in Breakers Literary Magazine are some of the worst poems you've ever read in your life. Atrociously bad, angsty teenage boy poems. Because nobody starts out writing Prince of Tides. You work your way toward that. But you need opportunities to do that. And Breakers gives Pat a really remarkable opportunity to be read, to be appreciated, to start to know what it's like to have an audience. It means so much to young Pat Conroy at 17 that by his senior year at Beaufort High, this happens. He joins the literary magazine staff. He's a student editor, one of several. So at 17, 18 years old, Pat Conroy has already decided he's going to be a writer who helps other writers, which is the whole arc of the rest of his life. Beaufort High makes that possible. These 5 students we're looking at up here, obviously Pat's the only male, probably guessed that part on your own, but 3 out of 5 of these kids actually go on to have careers in literature, not just Pat. Next to Pat is Julie Zakowski. She becomes Beaufort County's library director and held that position for years and years, just retiring a few years ago, still lives in Beaufort. She and Pat were lifelong friends. In the middle there is another military brat, Stephanie Austin Edwards. Stephanie goes on to have a really remarkable career in Broadway and in Hollywood as a dancer and a costumer, doing all kinds of interesting things behind the scenes. She comes back to Beaufort about the same time Pat does in the 1990s, after he's been gone for a while. They rekindle their friendship. Stephanie now has a novel out, and she is the chair of our local writing group. They meet twice a month in our Conroy Center, in fact, and she's been a really wonderful instructor for a lot of writing workshops that we've done at the Conroy Center as well, because this friendship meant so much to her early on. Well, at Beaufort High, Pat starts to meet this great group of teachers too, and he's at an age where he too is looking for those models of adulthood who are different than his abusive father. He's looking for a different way to become an adult, and specifically a different way to become a man. And he finds them in some of his teachers. This is Jean Norris, who was Pat's junior year English teacher. And Pat wrote quite a bit about Mr. Norris. If you've ever read a book called My Reading Life, there's a very long chapter in there called The Teacher, which is the heart and soul of the friendship that Pat had with Gene. But here's how he described him in short form. His eloquence was so understated that it was almost unnoticeable. He displayed a complete assurance in the composure and ease he brought to the art of teaching. At the end of the first day, I was impressed with the man. By the end of the first week, I was in love with him. He taught his students a language that was fragrant with beauty, treacherous with loss, comfortable with madness and despair, and a catchword for love itself. Gene also shows Pat what it might look like to become a teacher. And it is in Gene Norris's classroom, which is right there, that young Pat Conroy starts to think about maybe he too wants to become a teacher one day. Well, Gene was only Pat's teacher for 1 year, his junior year, but they had a lifelong friendship, continued well beyond Beaufort High. Here they are much later in life, all suited up in that one, obviously for an award ceremony, but it's not Pat Conroy getting an award, it's Gene Norris getting a Lifetime Achievement Award from the South Carolina Teachers Association. Gene had a remarkable career as a teacher, and Pat Conroy was a small part of that from Gene's perspective, perhaps. One of many, many students that passed through Gene Norris's classroom, many of whom were also inspired to become teachers just as Pat was. This photo here, there's Pat in the middle in his suspenders phase, and there's Gene right there. And another guy we'll get to in just a second. They're in Barbra Streisand's New York apartment after the film premiere of The Prince of Tides. That day was so important to Pat, he wanted some of his teachers to be there with him as well, and Gene was one of them. The other guy is kind of faded in the corner there. That's this guy. That's Bill Duffert, who was Pat's Beaufort High School principal, another sort of surrogate father figure to young Pat Conroy. And here's how Pat described him. This is from an address Pat gave to a group of education students, future teachers at USC in Columbia, 1995. When you went to Bill Duffert's school, the one thing you knew was that you were one of his kids and you had a responsibility to your school because it was your community, your part of the world. I never saw anyone get that across better, and I went into teaching because of Bill Duffert, because he had convinced me that there was no way a human being could live upon this earth and do anything better than to teach young people. It affected me, and I'm simply one of hundreds who it affected. Now, Mr. Conroy would occasionally exaggerate. That may be new information to some of you. The rest of you may sort of understand that already. But I think this is quantifiably true. I think there are multiple hundreds of people who are teachers because of Bill Duffert and the good example he gave over the 40-year career that he served in public education. He too was a remarkable man, and he showed Pat what it meant to be a leader, not just a teacher, but a leader. It's a lesson that Pat learned from Bill Duffert. And they too were lifelong friends. Dr. Duffert goes on to have, as I said, this 40-year career, spending most of it successfully integrating schools across South Carolina in a number of really remarkable ways, one of which got him featured in the New York Times. He and Pat, lifelong friends. Here they are. This is Pat just before his 70th birthday. This is Bill Duffert just before his 90th birthday. Once again, an award ceremony, and once again, it's not Pat getting the award. This is Dr. Duffert getting the South Carolina Governor's Award in Humanities for his career in education, an award Pat had received earlier, and Pat was there that day not just to celebrate with Dr. Duffert, but to introduce him as well. Dr. Duffert's still alive, incidentally, 93 years old, maybe 94 this year, still actively involved in education in his hometown in Newberry. Just an incredible guy. Comes to Beaufort every so often, sits down with me and tells me everything I'm doing wrong, as he used to do for Pat. So he's become a great mentor to me also. So we've talked about two guys, and this story needs a woman, and it's a really remarkable woman too. This is her. This is a writer named Ann Head. She was married to a guy named Howard Head. Anybody play tennis or ski? You're familiar with Howard tennis rackets, or Head tennis rackets, excuse me, Head skis. He was a guy who invented all that. That came a little bit later. She had divorced him by the time he started doing cool stuff like that, and married a local doctor named Dr. Morris. So when Pat met her, she was writing under the name Ann Head, but she was known locally as Ann Morris or Mrs. M. And she was writing short stories that were being published in all the major women's magazines of the day. She had a number of novels published as well, all with Doubleday, the publisher that will eventually publish Pat Conroy. One of those books, let me find it here, Mr. and Mrs. Bojo Jones. It was made into a TV film starring Desi Arnaz Jr., and it's often credited as one of the two books that helped create the young adult novel genre alongside The Outsiders. So she was a remarkable, remarkable writer. She descended from good Beaufort people. She was not a trained teacher, but she was recruited by Gene Norris, Pat's English teacher, to lead the very first creative writing group that Beaufort High ever had. Gene had identified 6 students in his literature class who had remarkable potential as writers. Pat Conroy was one of them. So very early on, Pat got to learn not just about writing, but about the business of publishing from a real deal, fantastic novelist who just happened to be in Beaufort at the same time he was. It's pretty remarkable that their lives intersected in the way that they did. But again, as I said, Anne Morris was not a trained teacher like Gene Norris and Bill Duffert. She was not all warm and fuzzy, and here's what Pat had to say about that. On first sight, Mrs. Morris projected a steely withholding, an icy reserve that would have been off-putting to me, except for the thrilling fact she was the first novelist I'd ever met in the flesh. She looked like a woman who would not tolerate a preposition at the end of a sentence or the anarchy of a dangling participle. If anything, she seems kind of cold and off-putting in person, but Pat comes to realize something, and that's that she opens up on the page. She's one of those writers who can only be the truest version of herself when she's writing. So she and Pat become pen pals when he graduates Beaufort High, and he goes off to the Citadel. And it means everything to young writer Pat Conroy that he's able to take things that he's writing at the Citadel, send them back to Beaufort, and this amazing novelist and writer Ann Head can say, yeah, that's great, Pat, keep doing that, you're getting better. And it's not an easy thing to do because he's still writing some really terrible poetry when he's at the Citadel. Here's our guy at the Citadel, and I want to share with you one of those poems. It's a short one, I promise. Pat wrote it his knob year at the Citadel, his freshman year. And your job as a knob, as a freshman at the Citadel, particularly at this point in the 1960s, was to be invisible, was to not draw the additional attention of the upperclassmen, because you were going to get enough abuse as it was. You definitely didn't want to do anything to stand out. Well, Mr. Conroy took a slightly different approach when this poem was published in the Shaker, which is the literary magazine of the Citadel. It didn't just make him famous, it made him infamous, and he often referred to this as the most famous poem ever written in the history of the Citadel. This is it. The dreams of youth are pleasant dreams of women, vintage, and the sea. Last night I dreamt I was a dog who found an upperclassman tree. Oh, yes. There it is. Lovely piece of literature, isn't it? Yes. By his senior year at the Citadel, Pat is the poetry editor for the Shaker Literary Magazine. Once again, a writer helping other writers, and it begins with this. Well, I've been able to show you photos of Pat and his teachers later in life, and I wish that were true for Pat and Mrs. M, Ann Head, but she passed away not long after he graduated from the Citadel, within a year or two of when Pat graduated. So he didn't get to have this lifelong relationship with her that he did with many of his teachers. But here's what he did get, a sort of ritual. And this is Pat once again. At the time of her death, Mrs. M was the only writer I actually knew by sight, and her untimely and unforeseen death robbed me of a mentor I thought would help me navigate the fearful world of American publishing. I was lucky that she found me as a boy, and whenever I publish a new book, I take a rose to her headstone, place it before her without a word, respecting her detachment as part of the bond between us. Beautiful sentiment. I've gotten to know Ann Head's daughter, Nancy Thody, who's working on a biography about her mother. Nancy is a writer too, although primarily a playwright, so this is new territory for her. And in the course of helping her on this book about her mother, she asked me if there was anything she could do for me, and I said, yeah, I'd love to know where your mom is buried. I think I'd want to see where Pat has been taking these roses. And there were 2 books that had been published under Pat's byline after he died, the book called A Low Country Heart that I mentioned earlier, and an oral biography of Pat called My Exaggerated Life. So I felt like Pat owed Ann Head 2 roses, so Nancy and I took them to her mother's grave. And of all the places it could be, it's within walking distance of the Pat Conroy Literary Center. We didn't even have to get in a car. It's like 4 blocks from where we are. It's pretty amazing. So, till now, I've been telling you mostly about Pat as student and his reflections on his own teachers. We're going to flip that now, because this is the point that Pat himself becomes a teacher, and I want to share some reflections from some of his students and from Pat himself about what this was like. After he graduates from the Citadel in 1967, he comes back to Beaufort High, same Beaufort High he had gone to as a student himself, and he teaches there for 2 years. This is the 2 years before he goes to Daufuskie Island. He is teaching government and psychology. When Pat starts teaching, he realizes there's a problem at Beaufort High that nobody has addressed in this small southern town, and it's teen pregnancy. There is no sex education class, Beaufort High, but there's a need for one. So Pat decides to take it upon himself to incorporate human sexuality into his psychology class. And the teen pregnancy rate actually drops because of this. Something about hearing sexual intercourse described by Pat Conroy makes teenagers want nothing whatsoever to do with that. And if you've ever read Pat's attempts to write a sex scene in his novels, that's probably not new information to you. His second year there, he sees another opportunity, and once again, he wants to step in and do something about it. Beaufort High is not integrated at this point, but through a program called Freedom of Choice, there are a lot of African American families who have sent their kids to this predominantly white school. And the kids ask Pat, the young liberal teacher, if he will sponsor the Afro Culture Club, student organization for them. And he says, absolutely, I'll do that. But we should really incorporate this into the curriculum as well. So Pat wants to teach what turns out to be the very first African American studies class taught in any public school in the state of South Carolina. He is only allowed to do that by the principal, who's not Bill Dufford at this point. Dufford is elsewhere. Principal says, sure, you can do that if white students will sign up for it, which is probably a way of saying no without actually having to say no. But Pat had become so popular with the students that white students immediately signed up for this class and made it possible, made this historic class possible. So in his second year at Beaufort High, Pat is also teaching this African American Studies class. He published very little remembrances of these 2 years of teaching at Beaufort High. The novel he was writing when he passed away was going to dive back into those experiences, but it's difficult to find anything in print. Every so often, though, you find a little gem. And here's one. This is from an essay in the Low Country Heart. I consider the 2 years in Beaufort when I taught high school as perhaps the happiest time of my life. My attraction to melodrama and suffering had not yet overwhelmed me, but signs were surfacing. No one had warned me that a teacher could fall so completely in love with his students that graduation seemed like the death of a small civilization. Beautiful sentiment, absolutely beautiful sentiment. Let me tell you about her. So Pat's teaching this psychology class, right? Straight out of college, doesn't really know anything about anything. He's figuring it out while he's teaching it. This is one of the students from that psychology class. Her name's Valerie Sayers. Her father was a civilian psychologist at Parris Island at the Marine Corps base. So her father did for a living the thing that Pat was stumbling around this classroom trying to learn how to teach. Valerie should have been Pat's toughest critic, but here's how she described her teacher, Pat Conroy. We must have called him Mr. Conroy, but that's hard to imagine. Outside class, if we thought we were cool, we referred to him as Pat. When we gossiped, we called him Pat Conroy, one word on one breath, a movie star's name. When he paced our high school psychology classroom, he was all performer, good looking, in a Paul Newman, Cool Hand Luke kind of way, only taller, younger, cooler. He was master of the sudden pause, the beat, the punchline. He told us funny, self-deprecating stories, his fears, his gaffes, and we didn't believe a word. 2 years out of the Citadel, he was only 6 or 7 years older than we were. But he was Robert Kennedy, Wilt Chamberlain, and the Beatles rolled into one. Sounds like a remarkable teacher. It's from an essay Valerie wrote for this book right over here, Our Prince of Scribes, that we'll get to in just a second. But that's Valerie then. This is Valerie now, give or take a couple of years. She wrote a novel called Due East, which is set in a fictional version of Beaufort, South Carolina, and then she went on to write 5 more novels. 2018, she was inducted into South Carolina's Literary Hall of Fame, just as her teacher, Pat Conroy, had been. 2 of her books, the first 2, Due East and Who Do You Love, were made into a film starring Sybil Shepherd for one of the cable networks. So she's gone on to have a really remarkable career as a writer as well. She never had an English class with Pat Conroy, but he taught storytelling as part of his psychology class. And she started picking up then and came back around to it. How big of an influence was Pat on Valerie? Check this out, they have matching author photos. Isn't that weird? That's so weird. Why is that even possible? But they too were lifelong friends. This is Pat, once again, just before his 70th birthday. That's Valerie right next to him on that side, and 3 of her other classmates from that psychology class. In the same way that Pat had lifelong friendships with his teachers, he also had that with almost all of his students as well. So after 2 years of teaching at Beaufort High, populations in Beaufort have changed, and again, this has to do with integration. What we would now think of as white flight schools are starting to emerge, private schools, private academies. There's not a need for as many classroom teachers at Beaufort High as there had been. Pat's on a year-to-year contract, and they simply don't need him as a teacher in the 3rd year. But he becomes so popular with not only the students, but with many of the teachers at that point, that they actually offer him the chance to become assistant principal. He's 2 years into his teaching career. That's pretty remarkable. Pat absolutely loved being in the classroom, and he wanted to stay. He was actually thinking at that point about going into the Peace Corps, and then he realized he could have a Peace Corps-like experience without even leaving Beaufort County. And that's what sends him out to Daufuskie Island, 1969-1970 school year. He is not only the first white teacher on the island, he is the first male teacher. He has 18 students, grades 5 through 8. He has absolutely no training whatsoever with students this young. None, 0. He gets out there and he realizes that separate has not been equal whatsoever, and that these students, through no fault of their own, have been denied the kind of education that their white counterparts in town have had. Many people would have just given up at that point, would have walked away from it, but not Pat Conroy. He was too determined. And he dedicated that year to not only teaching them what was required by the school district, but what was necessary for the lives he knew they were going to have off that island. He could see that their future was not to live the same lives that their parents were living. They needed to know about the larger world off the island, and he absolutely dedicated himself to doing that. Many of the kids had no idea what the Atlantic Ocean was called. They called it the beach. They didn't know it had another name. They thought Savannah was the largest city in the world because it's the only city they had ever heard of. Not their fault. Their world had been very small and insular because no one had brought the larger world to them. So that's what Pat Conroy did. And I want to share the reflections of one of those students in particular. It's the young woman in the middle with her hand raised right there. That's Sally Ann Robinson. Anybody ever heard of Sally Ann? A few of you. Excellent. Here's how she described her teacher, Pat Conroy. That year was unforgettable for me. Pat was patient and generous. He made every day an adventure while teaching us about history, math, spelling, reading, music, you name it, he taught it. And all the while, he was preparing us for the wide world we were going to face once we left our island. He could take the words in a book and bring them to life for us, and we were amazed. I got up every morning wanting to go to school because this wonderful teacher would be there who would make learning fun while opening our eyes to a future we didn't know was ours. Once again, a remarkable reflection, remarkable student. Pat and Sally Ann go on to become lifelong friends as well. She's the author of 3 cookbooks now. Pat wrote the foreword to the first one and toured nationally right alongside his Daufuskie Island student. She also is the only native islander who gives tours of the island. You can go spend the whole day with Sally Ann Robinson on Daufuskie Island, which is a really remarkable thing to get to do. Well, our remarkable teacher, Pat Conroy, got a reward from the school board for being such an amazing teacher with these students. He got fired. He was far too progressive for the time, from the perspective of the school superintendent and the school board. And if Pat had stayed on the island and just taught the kids there, he probably would have gotten away with it for a much longer period of time. But he didn't just want to tell them about the world, he wanted to show them the world. So he brought them into Beaufort to go trick-or-treating on Halloween. They knew what Halloween was, they knew what trick-or-treating was, but houses are so far apart on Daufuskie Island because of how rural it was at the time. Kids didn't do that. So he brought them into the historic district, which is to say the white district. Word got back to the superintendent about that. He funded, with no money whatsoever from the school district, a trip to take these kids to Washington, D.C., where Pat himself had gone on his senior trip in high school, where he had lived before the family came to Beaufort. He thought it was really important and empowering for young kids to get to see Washington and learn about their country in the capital of that country. So he took them to Washington. At that point, they were getting a quality of education that wasn't only equal to their white counterparts, it was superior to their white counterparts. So the district started compiling reasons to get rid of Pat Conroy, and in the end they had enough and made a successful move that did not allow Pat Conroy to ever get another job as a professional educator ever again. What it did for Mr. Conroy, however, was light the fuse that led to the book The Water is Wide and every other book that came after it. It gave Pat something to write about. It lit a fire in him that may not have been there with that intensity at that age otherwise. And as I've said from my own experiences, he continued to be a teacher, not in the classroom sense of that word, but in the much larger sense of the word, of mentoring others. This is a book you're probably all familiar with, Prince of Tides. And in that book, in the character of Tom Wingo, the protagonist, Pat says this: "There is no word in the language I revere more than teacher. My heart sings when a kid refers to me as his teacher, and it always has. I've honored myself and the entire family of man by becoming a teacher." Again, that's the character, Tom Wingo, but that's very much the writer, Pat Conroy, speaking in those words as well. He was friend and mentor to so many writers, so many of us, over the course of that 50-year writing career. When he passed away, March 4th of 2016, we realized he had one final lesson as a teacher, and it has to do with where Pat is buried. He's on St. Helena Island, 2 sea islands out from Beaufort. This is his gravesite. He is in an African-American Baptist cemetery, and he is a Roman Catholic white guy. So he is integrating that cemetery. That takes a lot of special permission. The reason Pat decided to be buried where he is he is on grounds that are part of Penn Center. Are any of you familiar with Penn Center? You're about to be. Penn Center was created during the Civil War. A group of Quakers and Methodists came down from New York from the north, to educate the newly freed African-American slaves. And it was a remarkable model for what a school like that can and should look like. In the 1950s and 60s, however, when Pat was a student, Beaufort High, it became this other sort of place. One of the few places in the country where blacks and whites could gather safely together. So it became a haven of activity during the civil rights movement. And Pat's teacher, Gene Norris, would take young 16, 17-year-old Pat Conroy out there to see some of the major figures of the civil rights movement and to meet them. So this is how Pat described it. "It was at Penn Center that I met Dr. Martin Luther King on a street now named for him. I also met Ralph Abernathy, Andy Young, Jesse Jackson, Julian Bond, and the entire leadership of that fabulous civil rights movement that brought the South kicking and screaming into the 20th century. I watched my whole country change because of meetings that had taken place at Penn Center. I'm living proof that Penn Center can change a white boy's life. You changed me utterly, and I'm forever grateful to you." Pat knew that his readers and his fans would want to visit his gravesite in the same way that he visited the graves of writers who were dear to him, Thomas Wolfe in particular. You can't get to Pat's grave without going through Penn Center and learning at least a little something about that history. And we think of that as Pat's last act as a teacher. He knew we would come. He knew we would learn something. So as our way of honoring that at the Pat Conroy Center, we took the anniversary of Pat's death, March 4th, and we turned it from a day of grieving into a day of learning. So we now have an annual March 4th at Penn Center where we talk about social justice and the environment and literature and storytelling and all of these topics that were near and dear to Pat. This will be our 4th year to do this, coming up on Sunday, March 1st. And we've got a great group of presenters who are coming with us. We do a nature walk of the grounds. Dr. Drew Lanham is coming to lead that. He's done this for us for a couple of times. Dr. Richard Gergel, who is another student of Bill Duffert, Pat's high school principal, is coming to talk about a civil rights book he just published. The director of history and culture at Penn Center, Victoria Smalls, will be with us. Anybody familiar with Robert Smalls, the story of Robert Smalls from Beaufort? All right, that's an opportunity too then. Robert Smalls, first African-American hero of the Civil War, liberated a Confederate gunship from the harbor in Charleston, turned it over to the Union Army, was the captain of that boat during the Civil War, comes back to Beaufort afterward, becomes a U.S. congressman, is really a central figure in that time during Reconstruction of equal access to education for everybody. It's an incredible story. This woman right here, Becky Bruff, recently wrote a novel about Robert Smalls called Trouble the Water. She'll be one of our speakers. And this guy right here, Donald Sweeper, is a historical interpreter who performs as Robert Smalls. So he will be there in the persona of Robert Smalls on March 4th as well. Really a powerful day to spend. But this is us. That was a program. This is the center itself. We have about 3,000 square feet of interpretive space. Have things like Pat Conroy's writing desk, which we can see right there. That's the desk he had at his Fripp Island home. So some part of every book from Beach Music forward was written longhand at that desk. For a little over a year now, we've been TripAdvisor's top-ranked destination in Beaufort. We're only coming up on 4 years old, in a town filled with museums and tourist attractions. So it's pretty remarkable that we've risen to the top so quickly. And while that has a little bit to do with the artifacts we have, it has a lot more to do with the guides that we have, the docents. Virtually every person who leads a tour at the Pat Conroy Center actually knew Pat personally and is able to share their own personal stories in addition to showing our visitors the stuff. We are a nonprofit. It's entirely free to visit the center. We do, however, happily accept donations. We have this wonderful donation box that was made by a group of high school students from Bluffton, South Carolina, one town over from Beaufort. If you can see it up there, it's a metal sculpture. The welding class made this. The base is the outline of the state of South Carolina. There are 2 palmetto trees growing up out of it. And there's a book on top representing reading, writing, and teaching. Students came up with that design entirely on their own. We just asked for a donation box. Everything else was their doing. When they delivered it to us, I asked their teacher, this guy right here, Bradley Childress, why it had this weird metallic jingle to it. As you can see, it's got a lot of these metal palm fronds on there, and I thought maybe one had come broken when they brought it over in the pickup. And he said the class meets after lunch, and after we got the box built, the kids started putting their change into it. So that was the metallic jingle to it. It already arrived with a donation in it, and we left those coins in it to this day as a sort of good luck charm. I want to show you another kid who's pretty remarkable, and it's this guy right here. His name is Anthony Johnson. This portrait he is doing of Pat Conroy is something called journal art. He's not actually drawing anything. This is all done with words. If you could see this thing up close, you would recognize letters and words on it. What Anthony did is he read The Water is Wide for the first time, and he started copying lines from The Water is Wide in Pat's words, and then he started stream of consciousness responding to it. So this whole thing is written and not drawn. If he needed something to be completely dark, he would just keep writing words over it until it was blacked out. It's an amazing piece. It was the 3rd piece he had ever done in this style. And thanks to a very nice group of donors, we were able to buy this for the Conroy Center. That's me the day I gave the check to young Anthony, probably the first or second sale he ever had in his young career. He does mostly commissioned work. We let people know we had this. Now everybody wants one, so he's got more work than he can handle. But hopefully when he graduates, he's coming to SCAD. That's certainly his dream, and it looks likely to happen at this point. We teach a number of writing classes at the Conroy Center, too. We have workshops for writers, and we lead book club discussions as well. This is Becky Bruff, the woman I mentioned just a couple of slides ago, who wrote the Robert Smalls novel. This is one of the first classes she came to. This is on historical novels, historical fiction, and she credits this class and experiences like this for helping her get a novel done so well and so quickly. This is our instructor, Michelle Stone, who was there from Spartanburg, South Carolina, with her book, Border Child. In the back there is a Japanese-born poet who lives on Hilton Head Island. Her name is Miho Kinos. She had such a good time taking that class that she became one of our instructors, too. That's Miho once again in the back. This is our summer camp, Camp Conroy, which we offered for the first time in 2018. We had 9 students, middle schoolers. Our youngest guy, AJ, there was 8. Everybody else is a little bit older. And over the course of 2 weeks, they wrote, illustrated, designed, edited, and published a 32-page picture book together about conservation in the Low Country. Really remarkable experience. Miho and 2 other instructors led that camp. We did a lot of things wrong that first year. We learned so much about how to run a summer camp that we felt much more prepared in 2019, thought, maybe if we go from 9 students to 12, we'll be ready for that this year. 12 seems like a good, safe number. So we had 30 students, which seemed like a really good idea at the time. We outgrew the space we started in, so we needed to find a larger space, and Beaufort County School District stepped up and offered us some spaces at what is now Beaufort Middle School. But that used to be Beaufort High School when Pat Conroy was a student and teacher. So we were back on the very same campus that Pat Conroy had been for this version of Camp Conroy. And in addition to our 3 instructors, we were able to recruit a number of college-age camp counselors originally as volunteers, but we had a donor who decided those kids did a remarkable job, those college students, and they really need to be paid. And that donor's name was Bill Dufford, once again Pat Conroy's high school principal, who had been a principal at this very school, stepped up and made sure that those kids were taken care of too. So we'll be offering this again in 2020. We're just about to announce registration for it. I want to tell you, as we start to wrap up here, about this project, which happens to be available for sale tonight, although this is not a commercial for it. That's me, obviously. This is my friend Nicole Seitz. She's a novelist and artist from Charleston, South Carolina, and like me, she too was mentored by Pat Conroy. And when Pat announced to the world that he was sick with pancreatic cancer, Nicole and I had a conversation about starting to gather stories from writers who had been influenced by Pat, trying to get those together quickly in a very small volume that maybe even Pat would get a chance to read, to understand how much he meant to all of the writers whose lives he touched. He passed away 2 weeks after we had that conversation. That's how quick it was. There was simply no time to do that. So Nicole and I slowed the project down a little bit. We spent about a year and a half gathering what in the end were 67 reflections from writers who knew Pat Conroy. Famous writers that you've heard of, like Barbra Streisand, Patty Callahan Henry, Mary Alice Monroe, Pulitzer Prize winner Rick Bragg, Pulitzer Prize winner Kathleen Parker, major writers to whom Pat was friend and advocate and teacher. Folks like Sally Ann Robinson and Valerie Sayers, who I've introduced you to in the slides, and a whole lot of writers you've never heard of in your life. 67 of us all together participated in the project. And we've won 7 awards so far, which I understand is pretty good. So that's been a nice experience. Mostly what we've been doing, though, is not just letting the book sit in bookstores, but the 67 of us who are in it go out and tell stories together as a panel, as a group discussion. And of the 67 writers in the book, 53 have now participated in at least one event across 10 states. I have no idea how many that we've done, probably close to 70 at this point. This is us in front of an audience of close to 300 people in Beaufort. That's me, once again. That's Cassandra King Conroy, Pat's widow. His best friend from Beaufort High, Bernie Shine, and his former assistant, Margaret Evans, who's now a magazine publisher in Beaufort. And if that sounds like a really cool thing to see, guess what? You can totally see that, because we're coming to Savannah on March 15th, and we're doing this in partnership with the Flannery O'Connor Childhood Home downtown. Will be me and Sally Ann Robinson, who we've talked about, one of Pat's Defusky Island students, and John Worley, who was a Citadel classmate of Pat's, class of 67. John is now the author of 5 novels of his own, really remarkable writer and storyteller as well. So we'll do that, again, March 15th in the afternoon. That's now up on the website for the Flannery O'Connor home. But let's get back to Nicole, my impossibly over-talented co-editor, because about 70 days before this book came out, she drew this sketch of Pat Conroy. Very nice piece of artwork. She posted it online and people responded really well to it. So the next day she posted this sketch of Barbra Streisand, who wrote the foreword to our Prince of Scribes. And once again, people responded really well. And then Nicole did the math. There's about 68 days until publication, 67 contributors. She could actually sketch all of us if she did one a day. And so she did. Do y'all have that one friend who's kind of amazing at everything? It's super annoying, isn't it? Yeah, so it's like that. So we turned that into an art exhibit. Nobody thought of this beforehand, it just kind of happened. So that exhibit was originally displayed at the Pat Conroy Literary Center. It's since been to the Southern Independent Booksellers Alliance trade show. It was on Hilton Head as part of Crescendo, just recently took it down after an extended run, and it's about to go to 2 locations in Florida. So in addition to having this book and doing these public programs for our Prince of Scribes, now there's an art exhibit as well that tours around that I hope you all get a chance to see at some point. It's pretty remarkable to hear the stories, even in short form, from all the people to whom Pat Conroy was a teacher in the big sense of that word. Where are we at? We're all right. So I want to give the second to last word to a kid. Pat Conroy was a teacher. I've gotten to become a teacher now in this role at the Pat Conroy Literary Center. And many of my students are inmates who wear orange jumpsuits, as I said early on. This is the one who isn't. This is Holland Perryman. She is a Beaufort High School student today, and very much like Pat Conroy was in the 1960s, she is her class president, probably the best writer in the school, standout athlete. She's sort of the modern version of Pat Conroy right now. And I get to be her mentor, because her parent showed up and said, "Wouldn't you like to have a student intern?" And I said, "No, I don't want a student intern. No, I absolutely don't want that." And then I met her, and I saw her writing, and I got to talk to her a little bit, and I was just amazed. So she helps us out with a lot of things, and one day we gave her an iPad in a few minutes and asked her to talk a little bit about what the experience has meant to her, and this is off the cuff. This is just her being her.
Hi, I'm Holland Perryman, and I'm an intern at the Pat Conroy Literary Center. So I actually wanted to intern at the center for a while. Back in 8th grade, when we were doing job shadowing, I wanted to be a writer. So one of the things that I got to do was visit the Pat Conroy Literary Center. And I was just absolutely enthralled by how amazing the center was itself, but also how passionate the people were who worked there. And I wanted to intern somewhere where I was going to be passionate about what I was doing. And I wanted to feel like I was making a good impact. And since then, since I became an intern, all of those dreams have come true for me. I've gotten to work with the most amazing people who are so passionate about what they do, passionate about stories and furthering Pat Conroy's legacy and making a good difference. And I've gotten to be part of that. And this internship has meant so much to me, not only as a writer and a student, but also just as a person. I've gotten to go to events and programs and workshops, and I've had the opportunity to sit in and soak up all of the knowledge. And I've gotten to meet the most fascinating people who have stories to tell. And they get to tell those stories because the Pat Conroy Literary Center gives them a platform to do so. And it's also just so incredible to think back and say, wow, I was a part of that.
I'm not going to tell you how old she is, but she's 2 years away from being old enough to read a Pat Conroy novel. At least under my watch. But it's a remarkable thing that we've gotten to do. We've had college-age interns as well. She's not our only one, but certainly the most impressive one. So that was our second to last word. The last word is actually going to go to that guy right there, Pat Conroy, because I want to tell you about a letter that we received from Pat Conroy after he passed away, which is a super weird thing to get, by the way. You ever get a letter from a deceased person? It's really unnerving. It happened in October of 2016. Remember, Pat passed away March 4th of 16, so this was several months later. What made it even stranger, it was not a letter from old man Pat Conroy, who had been my friend and my mentor. We got a letter from this guy, from 23-year-old Pat Conroy, first-year teacher Pat Conroy. And what had happened is that Mr. Conroy had written this letter to Bill Dufford, once again our high school principal, in 1968. 1968 was Pat's first year teaching at Beaufort High, and at the end of that year he took a summer excursion to Europe to meet up with a couple of other first-year teachers for their big European holiday. And on his way over he probably wrote a bunch of letters, but one of them was this letter to Bill Dufford, who had been his teacher, had been the guy who had inspired him in many ways to become a teacher. Pat in 1968 thought he was always going to be in the classroom, always be an educator. He's not been out to Defusky, he's not been fired, none of those things have happened. It's a remarkably earnest letter written from one teacher to another teacher, to the guy who was in many ways a surrogate father to him. Just beautiful in that context alone. But when we found it in October of 1968 in Bill Dufford's archive at Newberry College, it somehow seemed to be, October of 2016, excuse me, is when we found it. It seemed to be about that moment as well. October of 16 was when we were about to open the Pat Conroy Literary Center to the public for the very first time, about to announce that the festival that had begun as Pat's 70th birthday was going to continue as our annual Pat Conroy Literary Festival, as it does to this day, and about to announce that I was leaving the University of South Carolina Press, where I was director, to become the first director of the nonprofit Pat Conroy Literary Center. That's what we were about to send out to the world. And somehow Pat managed to write about all of those things in 1968. It seemed in every way like it was a letter from beyond the grave. Just an incredible discovery. Found in the Newberry archive by an archivist named Tracy Power, who shared it with Bill Dufford, who shared it with the rest of us. And to this day, I think it's some of the most amazing words Pat Conroy ever wrote. I'd like to share it with you, but I checked my watch and we're out of time. So y'all have a good night. And come see us if you get a chance. Why is everybody still seated? Do you want to know what's in the letter? This is it. This is 23-year-old Pat Conroy to his teacher, Bill Dufford. I have never understood the dynamics of hero worship. Maybe it was the discovery of the Father I never had as a youth and finally found in you. A Father who is not only stern but tender, a Father of both the storm and the sun. It is important for you to know this effect you have had, and I believe you know it, but in the shortness and horrible brevity of life, I want to get everything said. Everything. Someday I'll exert the same influence over someone, and I want him to tell me. This is immortality. For what I've learned from you, I will pass on, and it will be passed on, and it will be passed on, and passed on. Beautiful, beautiful letter. And that last line, that's effectively the mission statement of the Pat Conroy Literary Center. That's what we've been doing in this room for the last hour. I've taken the lessons that Pat learned from his teachers and shared with his readers and his students, and I've shared them with all of you in the hopes that you'll take them and pass them on, and pass them on, and pass them on. And for me to get to do that for this guy, who was my teacher and my mentor in so many amazing ways, is my absolute honor. So I want to thank you all so much for coming out and hearing me tell some stories. And I very much hope you come see us in Beaufort sometime at the Conroy Center. Be happy to answer any questions you have. Thank you. Yes, sir. Your hand went up very quickly.
Very quickly.
Yes.
As I recall, Pat was in Atlanta in the maybe the late 70s. I think I attended a party at his home,
You had a good time.
Ansley Park,
Yes.
although it's been a long time, so I don't remember that. Why was he in Atlanta? What was he doing there? Do you know?
Yeah, so the question, if you didn't all hear it, is why was Pat Conroy in Atlanta in the 1970s? Because he couldn't be in South Carolina. Because after he was fired on Defusky Island, he was too controversial to get a job anywhere in this state. Pat told the story, and remember, Pat's stories aren't always true, but there's a grain of truth to them, about going up to Spartanburg in the upstate after he had given up trying to get a job anywhere in the Low Country. He was married to his first wife, Barbara. They had 3 young daughters at this point, trying to get a job on a chicken farm. And he gets up there for this interview, and the farmer meets him at the door, at the screen door, won't let Pat in, and says, "Son, are you that guy who was fired for teaching on that island?" And Pat said, "Yes, sir, that's me." And the farmer, according to Pat, says, "I'm sorry, but I need somebody I can trust with these chickens." Is that story true? No, but the sentiment probably is. Pat was infamous in South Carolina, and he could not find employment there. So he went back to Atlanta, which is actually the city he was born in. That was not his first time in Atlanta, second time. Barbara goes into law school, and Emory has a remarkable career. Pat starts writing what will eventually become the Great Santini and sort of launches himself into his literary career. Spends a lot of time hanging out at the old New York bookshop, which Pat writes about in My Reading Life, always owned by Cliff Graubart, a good friend of Pat's. And that introduces Pat into Atlanta literary life. So he starts hanging out with a lot of the other writers, sort of teaches Cliff how to run a bookstore, how to have book parties, how to be part of literary culture. And Pat and some other figures at that time really start to make a literary life happen in Atlanta that probably wouldn't have happened if he hadn't been there. So he stays there for a while, divorces Barbara, marries his third wife. They go live in Rome, they go live in San Francisco. They eventually divorce in the 1990s. At that point, Pat has what is probably a third home on Fripp Island, which he's bought to be a writer's retreat, but divorced from his second wife just before his 50th birthday, and that's now his only residence. So that becomes his home, and that begins the second act of his South Carolina life. But that's why he's there in Atlanta.
Was he an alcoholic at the time?
Absolutely. Yeah, unquestionably so. Probably sober right up through his Citadel experiences. Every so often, somebody from the Citadel will tell some story about getting drunk with Pat. That never happened. He was a good Catholic kid then. It was when he met those other first-year teachers in Beaufort that part of his life began. And this is true of so many writers. That's probably not new information to a lot of you, who will turn to something, who will self-medicate in some way. And that was true for Pat for a long, long time. When I met him, during the period that I met him, is when he sobered up, when he really started taking care of himself. And he did it in many ways to prove a doctor wrong. If he wanted Pat to do anything, make it a challenge for him. Tell him he couldn't do it, and then he would go do it anyway. So he was probably in the best shape of his life when he was on stage at the Pat Conroy at 70 Festival. He's not only working out, he and his trainer had bought a gym. This is a good quick story too about Pat the Rescuer. He was working with a trainer at the YMCA, and through no particular fault of her own, she was fired. So he wasn't going to get to train with her at the YMCA anymore. So he said, well, you know, let's go open a gym around the corner from the YMCA and see if we can't siphon off some of that business, which they did. She owns that facility to this day. It's not in the same location. But that's how serious he was about getting his life back in shape at that point.
And
So
how old was he?
Thanks for sharing.
when he passed away,
No, at that time you just described that point in his life.
when he went, what point? When he goes to Atlanta, or when he starts making these changes in his life?
When he's working out with this woman in the gym.
Sure, he's probably 65 or so. That's, again, during the last 5 years of his life. He was 70 when he passed away. Their last 5 years of his life when he and I were partners. I knew him for about 7 years before that, and he had begun that path toward recovery at that point. It was really his third marriage to Cassandra King, his soulmate in so many ways, that saved Pat, that started giving him something to live for that he might have been missing otherwise. Thanks for asking that. Yes, sir.
Hi, first of all, I've had the opportunity, fortunately, to visit the Literary Center and
Excellent.
also to visit the gravesite.
Yes.
And
Mhm.
so, and I recommend it to anyone. Go to Beaufort if you haven't been there. It's a great place. But could you comment or maybe tell a story about some of the things people have left on the gravesite? Because that's rather interesting.
Absolutely, yeah, I'd love to tell you a quick story or two about the gravesite. Now remember, Pat's a Roman Catholic white guy buried in an African American cemetery, so that in itself is fascinating. He was so happy just to get the special permission to be buried in the cemetery. He didn't really ask a lot of questions about where he was going to be buried. In the end, he got a nice spot if you pull into the cemetery, he's on the right-hand side, near the front, second or third row back, under some shade of a tree. Really lovely spot. His neighbor is really interesting, though. Of all the people Pat Conroy could be buried next to, he's buried next to a woman named Agnes Sherman. Miss Aggie, as she was known locally. She was one of the 2 African-American members of the school board that voted to fire Pat Conroy. So now they have all of eternity to work that out on themselves. Mrs. Watson, whose first name I forgot, who took care of Pat's daughters when he was teaching on Defusky, she's buried 1 row behind him and a few spaces back. But your question about the things that people leave, I used the term earlier, literary pilgrim, to describe this kind of people who come to visit the Conroy Center, but that's very true of the folks who go to the gravesite as well. They like to leave things. A lot of coins are left out there. That's a military tradition, and different denominations of coin means different things. I've served with or knew or met a relative. I don't remember the exact relationship between coin, and maybe nobody else does either, but a lot of coins get left out there. Mason jars of seawater from the ocean are out there. Things that you would associate with writing, so pens, some note cards have been left in a little sealed container out there. Eyeglasses. For a while, people were leaving cigars and little bottles of vodka and whiskey and all sorts of things that really shouldn't be out there. But some of the more interesting things that I've seen out there are people have left their own writing awards, something that you would think would be very special to them. They've left out there little tiny basketballs and baseballs, because Pat was an athlete, of course. And what else? There was a Spider-Man figure out there one day. That was super weird. I'm not sure why that was there. I have a friend who asked me to leave 2 copies of her audio CD. She's a musician and singer, and it was really special for her to have those left out there too. Now they're obviously going to be ruined, or somebody else will pick them up and take them. But just the act of doing it, just the act of leaving something behind is special to people. Here's the fascinating part of all of this. This is part of Gullah tradition. That's not the reason anybody is doing it. But pre-literacy in the African American community, if you went to a gravesite and you wanted somebody else to know that you were there, can't leave a note, don't know how to read or write, you would leave an object, something that would be related to the relationship that you had with the deceased. So the idea that Pat's readers are doing this in what is historically a gullah cemetery is very much in keeping with the backstory of that location. So I think it's remarkable that that happens. What sort of oddities did you see when you were out there?
There was a little doll there that had been there for months and they couldn't figure out where it
Yeah,
had come from.
I don't remember a doll, so I don't think I'd been out there at that point. Every so often, somebody goes out and collects things, and they go back to the family, and some, I think, get passed on to the Pat Conroy archive. So they're not left out there indefinitely, of course. But, yeah, it's interesting to see what people do and don't leave behind, absolutely.
Lots of pens.
Yes, lots of
Lots
pens.
of pens.
Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
So what was Pat's personality like?
What was his personality like? Yeah. Those of you who've read Pat may assume that he was deeply dark and disturbed all the time, because that's so much of what shows up on the page. Because he put that on the page, he didn't carry it around with him. He was one of the most naturally funny human beings I've ever met in my life. Quick-witted, kind-hearted. Again, remember, 70 years of life, not always the same guy, depending on where he's living, what part of his life he's in. I can only speak to the Pat I knew near the end. He was a remarkable man, showed me a model of service and kindness and dedication to others that I try to emulate every single day. A lot of us who knew him at that point in his life say that we're trying to be the people Pat thought we already were. And that, if that sort of captures him for you. Yeah, I fail at it every single day, by the way. He thought I was amazing, and I'm not there yet, but I'm working
Not
on it.
tonight. You're not feeling tonight.
Thank you. Thank you. Any other questions I can answer for y'all? I'm reminded I've got two other quick things to share with you, which I would have forgotten. But Pat wrote everything on yellow legal pads, which is why I carry one around with me. I mentioned the thing that we are doing with the Flannery O'Connor home on March 15th, but that's actually one of several events that we, the Conroy Center, are doing around here. Are any of you familiar with the Learning Center, Senior Citizens, Inc.? Yeah. I'm scheduled to do two things with them, one on February 10th, not far from where we are, wherever their Skidaway Island location is. And then the next day, February 11th, I'm doing something downtown. They're showing 3 of Pat's films in sequence, and then I'm speaking after the showing of the third film. So those are on the Learning Center website right now. I think registration is open, so you can sign up for those. And several of you have mentioned the Savannah Book Festival, either having seen Pat there or having seen Pat's widow, Cassandra King Conroy, there. She's going to be part of the Savannah Book Festival this year as well. I just looked up on the website. They did have her time posted. So on Saturday, February 15th, the free festival day, she's speaking at the Baptist Church at 10 o'clock. I think that's the same venue that Pat spoke in at least one year that he came to. So you can find that on the Savannah Book Festival website. If any of you are interested in signing up for our email list and learning more about what the Conroy Center does, either in Beaufort or anywhere else, you can just put your name and email address on that yellow legal pad there for me, and I'll add you to the list. And if anybody would like a copy of our Prince of Scribes, look at that, I happen to bring some with me, and I'd be happy to sign that for you. All the royalties go to the Conroy Center. None of the 67 of us in it make a dime off of it. We all did it out of love and honor for Pat Conroy, so it all stays with the center. And again, thank you all so much for coming tonight. It's been really wonderful.
I didn't mind. I wasn't loving it. I was just curious. His father was, you know, he went